So I've been drawing for some time. My drawings sometimes even start to look okay. But I've watched all those beginner videos. I've done all the exercises for skills and lines. How do I go beyond this beginner stage? How do I actually start to develop as an artist and not just someone who started to learn drawing? You see, it's not just about practice, though of course practice is very important. So important, it's not even a point. These 10 tips should provide a helpful framework for you to continue to develop your drawing ability and development, to go beyond this skill or that skill and start to combine them all. Pay particular attention to the last point in the video. It kind of draws together a lot of what's happening through the other points in a very important way. These 10 points are all things that I know have helped me tremendously, and I'm sure they'll help you too. Let's start. And my first tip is to make sure we keep developing our skill level at the skills that we think we've looked at. We don't know what we don't know we don't know. Teaching material is labelled beginner because it's just that. It's a beginning. There is more. But the more isn't always as easy to find. I've got some Australian parrots overhead. Perhaps I've looked at 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, even 4 point perspective videos. But have I looked at understanding perspective when it goes uphill? Do I understand how perspective works when the street goes downhill? How does perspective work when the street curves around? What if there are shadows being cast by my objects in perspective? Have I actually come to understand eye level and exactly what it means and how to find it and why it's so important? Or has it always been just a 10-second mention on the way to looking at vanishing points? Do I understand how perspective goes beyond just affecting the building and also affects all the architectural decoration which is on that building? Have I assumed that these beginner perspective videos with their simple boxes and vanishing points are actually the best way to understand perspective? And have I actually understood what the overall concept of perspective is all about? Or do I just have a series of almost mathematical steps that I hope I'm able to apply? So we need to find material that takes us beyond our current level of understanding in our drawing skills and techniques. And I've given you a clue where you can find some of it. My second tip is to go deep in one medium and one subject area, because we learn far more by going deep in one area than by going broadly over a much wider area with a much wider use of art materials. It's that saying, jack of all trades and master of none. I've only been drawing for 4 years, but for 10 years before that, I painted in oils, a very different subject, a very different medium, but I painted intensely for 10 years and for 4 years full-time. I learned about observation, about composition. I learned about handling paint, about mixing colours, about blending and layering those colours, and how to handle the particular strengths and weaknesses of oil paint. I learned how to create a sense of 3 dimensions with a 2-dimensional format. I learned how to juggle a dozen different possibilities for representing something and choose one. I learned to persevere and not give up, especially when there were so many leaves to paint. By painting similar subjects all the time, it was easier to get a sense of whether I was improving or not, or what was working better or not. And I learnt the very different challenges we face when we produce very large artworks or smaller ones. The different technical skills needed to reduce the scale of a subject from very large to very small. I was amazed when I started drawing how many of the lessons I learnt painting were readily applicable. Many of the skills I had developed by staying in the one medium and the one type of subject matter, I could actually transfer into drawing with pencil on paper. While I was painting in oils, I did a couple of pastel drawings. I did a few splashes with watercolour, but I only did the occasional things with them, and their skill level is very low. But by staying with the one medium in the one subject area, I was able to build and build and build on what I was learning. And then those skills were surprisingly transferable into a different area of art. Concentrate on the one thing at this stage. Learn to draw it really well, really skillfully, And then you can take those skills into almost any subject and even into other media surprisingly effectively. My third tip is really quick. When we first start to draw, there are often things that for some reason we shy away from drawing. Things that we think, oh, that's too hard, I can't do that. For me, it was cars and people. It was the architecture I loved and wanted to draw. So Notre Dame, of course, is always crowded with people in front, so I just left them all out. I managed to draw the Church of Les Invalides without any of the complicating street level cars and people. I found subjects where I could just concentrate on the subjects I felt more comfortable with. And we can still have fun drawing. We can even be quite arty in the way we avoid those elements we don't want to have to draw. But in the end, I got sick of all my drawings looking like the zombie apocalypse had come and there were no people left alive. Buildings look best when they're on a street, and streets have people and cars. And at some point I said to myself, I really have to learn to include them. And I'm so glad I did, because it's important that we address our fears and our lack of confidence in our drawing, or else there will always be things that hold us back from developing our art the way we really want to. There will always be things for all of us that are particularly intimidating, and learning to push through those things, learning they're not as bad as we think they're going to be, and that we can learn to do them is a really important skill. And besides giving us greater freedom in what we can draw, more importantly, it gives us greater confidence in our artistic skills and development. This fourth point is to work at creating a focus in the drawing. Before we start to draw, we should think, what is it we're wanting to achieve in this drawing? What effect, what is it about this scene that captures my attention, my interest, that I want to convey? So that we can manipulate all of the techniques and lines and skills that we have to create not just an accurate drawing of the scene, but to bring out the particular focus that we want. This drawing, which I made for a YouTube video on foreshortening of windows, I think, in my mind, is simply an accurate representation. The focus was getting these perspective angles correct and getting the foreshortening correct. So it's a technical focus. And when we're just beginning to draw, getting these technical elements correct is such an important part of our drawing that we can fall into the trap of thinking it's the only thing we're trying to achieve. But once we're more comfortable and experienced with some of the technicalities of drawing our subjects, we can start to focus on using those skills to highlight certain things or to create a feeling. So in this scene, I wanted this to be all about the spire. There was a lot down here that I chose to leave out. The detail of it would draw attention away from the spire, particularly since a lot of the detail was actually much closer than the spire. This signpost is much closer than the spire, but I increased the value of the tone on it to have it sit back slightly. I made these darks a little more uniform and took them a little higher because they make the spire pop out more. I simplified these buildings here so that the detail on them wouldn't compete with the detail here. And I put a dark value here, which wasn't in the reference, to help this section of the spire be really sharply in focus. These are the sorts of directions we can start to consider taking our drawings on once we've become more comfortable with the basics of the technical skills and techniques that we need with our materials, so that we can go beyond merely reproducing an accurate representation. For this next point, another thing that's helpful to do once we feel we've got the basics is to avoid our creative output being exactly the same things in exactly the same way. Creativity works best when there are new things happening in new directions. The new things actually feed into what we already know and greatly expand our skill level as well as our confidence. This was one of my earlier pencil drawings drawn from a photo, but it was very helpful for my drawing experience to go and do street sketching and to draw things directly from life. But then it's also good to change the style in which we draw. This drawing probably took me about 2 hours, but this drawing on an extremely exposed and windy headland, I drew in 15 minutes very briskly before I was blown away. Having a different time frame forced me to push my drawing technique in new directions. After a few years, I switched to drawing in pen, But my method was still a very detailed, meticulous grid in my photo and my paper, transferring the drawing in quite a lot of detail with pencil, which I then drew over and erased and then put the tone over the top. More recently, I've taken to drawing directly with ink, learning to commit with every line and learning how to deal with the lines that aren't quite in the right place. Now, I'm not saying this is the progression that anyone should go, but by changing some of the ways in which we do things, pushing ourselves into sometimes uncomfortable territory in our creativity can cause the skills that we have to interact with each other in new ways and often to grow considerably. So try and avoid doing things the same way all the time. Take some risks that may just fast track your improvement. This next point is avoid attempting drawing with too much abstraction or deliberate distortion at the start before developing an ability to draw whatever our subject matter is with a fair degree of realism. It's actually harder to draw some sort of abstraction of our subject than to draw it directly. There's far more creativity involved. But the best starting point is to be able to draw it accurately, and then from that place to choose how we're going to distort, abstract the line work, the subject matter, the effects, whatever. It's a case of first things first. My next point is buy the best materials you can afford. Not just afford to buy in the first place, but more importantly, afford to use up and have to replace. Anything will do as a beginner, but once we move past the beginner stage, then being able to use materials that develop a consistent feel, line, effect every time, both because of the quality of the materials and because we use the same brands every time, is an important part of developing finer skills in our drawing. Avoid buying things just because they're cheap. The important thing with this point though, is not whether we're spending a lot of money or a little money, but it's about being consistent with the materials that we use. That consistency in materials will advance our ongoing drawing development. And yes, this is how my desk actually looks right now. This next point is to find an artist who does similar work to what you're doing and what you would like to do to inspire you. Now, I don't mean for you to copy. Copying doesn't develop the skills we need to draw our own original pieces of work. But it can be tremendously encouraging to see what can be done, particularly if it's the sort of thing that we aspire to do in ourselves. And I can remember when I first began drawing, looking through Instagram at some of the work being done and thinking, man, it must be fantastic to be able to draw in this way. And sometimes I would look at some of these drawings in great detail. Again, not to copy, but to think, what technical skills or approaches can I see here that I could possibly use myself in my own drawing? One way I think it can be very helpful to use another artist's work is to find a reference, to find a subject that's very similar to what they draw. Maybe that's very similar to a particular drawing that they've done. Study the reference, study their drawing, and then put their drawing away and create our own original drawing from the reference. That way, what we've seen in their work becomes part of our creative process in creating our own drawing. So don't copy, but be inspired by other artists' work and think, how are they achieving the effect that I want to be able to achieve? And this tip is it can be incredibly helpful to deliberately vary the length of time we do our drawings in. At times, almost to give ourselves a drawing challenge of, I need to draw this in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, or as in this case, 20 minutes, or 2 hours, or 6 hours, or even 3 minutes, although I had help with this one. Once we've developed our technical skills past the beginner stage, by pushing ourselves out of our comfort zone, it sharpens not just our confidence but our creativity, helps us find new ways of doing things, helps us make new choices about how we represent things because we don't have time to do it the same way that we've always done it. It can be a tremendous spur to our creativity. One really good exercise for this is to get the one reference and to do a drawing from it that takes you a couple of hours. But then set yourself a 1 hour limit, a half hour limit, a a 15-minute limit, and even a 5-minute limit, because it actually becomes harder to reduce the detail with each drawing. It's easier to take 2 hours than 5 minutes, and it's a lot of fun. This tip is really important. If you can, find an experienced drawing artist and ask them to critique your work. And if you can't find a more experienced drawing artist, then find someone at least who will be honest with you. Because this is not about flattery. This is not about being told, oh, that's lovely, oh, you're very clever, because that won't take your art any further than where it is right now. This is about getting direction, about getting focus, where you will get the most impact for the time you spend, because we can't always see our weakest areas ourselves. We get used to what we draw the way we draw it. And so it's very hard for us to improve those areas when we're unaware of them. So we need a fresh set of eyes, and if possible, greater experience as well, to identify them and help us to see them. But if you can't find an artist, then find a good friend and ask them, is there anything about this drawing that to you doesn't look quite right? Or is there a part of this drawing that looks weaker than the other parts? They may not be able to identify exactly what the problem is, but they should be able to show you areas that you can then look at in more detail yourself. And then you can look to see whether I have any YouTube videos on those areas. Drawing is a journey that we're always on as long as we draw, and there's always new challenges, and there's always also room for improvements at whatever level of that journey we're at. But I hope these tips will progress your journey wherever you're up to a little faster and get you more directly to where you want to go with it. So please hit notifications if you want to see more tips and more videos like this to help you on in your drawing journey. I'll see you next time. Bye.